pastors, it's time we step up to the pulpits and call our parents to take the responsibility, whatever that takes, whatever's necessary, to show up, stand up, and be responsible for our kids. And not just send them on the bus to the school without question. We're past that day. Hi, I'm Dave Welch. I'm the founder and president of the Texas Pastor Council based in Houston, Texas, and the host of the Christian Citizen Podcast. Our mission is to restore the concept of citizenship as a functioning ministry of the local church, to promote the concept that our pastors should lead our flocks, our congregations, to be godly, active citizens into what we call the America Plan, which is just an acrostic for 7 major action steps where we for 22 years now, have been leading our churches to engage in, and that it is to articulate biblical positions from the pulpits on current issues of the day, M, to motivate our congregations to be active, godly citizens, E, to educate our congregations on the biblical, historical, constitutional framework of our citizenship, R, which is to register every eligible citizen to vote without exception, I, is to inform our congregation during election times on the candidates' positions on issues, things like party platforms and where candidates stand on those issues that matter for the office that they are running for. The C is to coordinate with other pastors in the community. We talk about team a lot. No pastor stands alone. We get the pastors of like mind together and coordinate, stand together and speak together in a united voice. And A is activate, to engage our congregations, not just in voting, but in bringing godly influence into the culture around us in every way. And that has been our mission. Today, we're going to talk about a critical issue here in Texas, and I'm going to address it from a personal and a professional standpoint, and that is what's called school choice education savings accounts in Texas and the 2025 legislative session in the form of SB 2. And that is the legislation that is now passed out of the Senate, has now gone to the House, and will be taken up by the House. The House may adopt its own version or, of course, modify SB 2, and they likely will. But the whole issue, bottom line here, is to address some fundamental questions and concerns that come out of the homeschool, the private school, the church community, citizens who are concerned about things like government overreach. Why would we be concerned about government overreach? Gee, I can't imagine why. I mean, after 4 years of a Biden administration, is there any question or any doubt after watching County Judge Lena Hidalgo in Harris County act like a dictator and others as well, after watching them shut down churches during COVID? I mean, why would we be concerned about things like government overreach? Well, of course, I'm being a little bit facetious here. The truth of the matter is those are legitimate concerns. And just quick background here, because 40 years ago, my wife and I, as our first child and subsequent other 4 children approached school age, we had to make a decision. And we lived in Washington State at the time. Yes, the People's Republic of Washington. And there is no way that we, in good conscience, could put our children in a government school, even knowing what we knew then, which was enough, but much less than what we've observed since then over these 40 years. But we knew that that system was rotten at its core, especially there. And so we frankly couldn't afford to educate our children and put them in our own church school. We just didn't have the income to do that unless we both worked full time. And we had made the decision, my wife was going to be an at-home mom. And so we homeschooled our kids through all the years of schooling, all 5 of those starting in 1992. So we've been at this a while. And our children, our adult children now, are homeschooling our grandchildren. And I thank God for that they have picked up that mantle and that call. So as they all now have children that are school-aged, and they have these same questions. Because frankly, if you've chosen to homeschool in particular, you don't want the government come knocking on your door telling you how to raise your children, how to school your children, what to teach your children. You've taken them out and sacrificed specifically for that reason, to be free to follow your conscience and your faith. And of course, those who have chosen private school and are able to do private school, whether it's church, parochial, or even a charter school, then there's also a decision and a sacrifice to move them out of the primary main government system, what I call the government monopoly. And so along the way, over these years, over these decades, we had to make that choice, knowing full well that we as good citizens had to pay our taxes too. And those taxes fund the government school system that we couldn't use in good conscience. So that basically meant that we were paying twice. And when you have multiple children, then you're paying multiple times for not just curriculum, but of course, every homeschool family knows that you're paying for sports programs, you're paying for all sorts of additional costs, supplemental classes that you want to take, whether it be co-op or now online classes, video courses, all those things that came out of your pockets. And that has put a real strain on a lot of families, and homeschool families in particular. I can speak to this. It's not just the cost of the education and the time invested. And the time is huge, as we well know, but it's also the sacrifice, if you will, that many of those families, ours included, when the wife stepped away from the workforce. My wife was a nurse, and she could have made a lot more money than I was in many of those years, especially in our years in small business and ministry. So we decided, though, that income was less important than the hearts and minds and souls of our children. So we made that decision. And thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of families have made the same decision. So what do we do now? What do we do with SB2 when there's an effort finally in Texas to break the government monopoly and take some of the funding that's going into the government for the purpose of education and redirect it so parents have a choice to take some of that money and help their kids in a different environment and apply that to private schooling? Now, I'm going to address a couple specific things. Senator Bob Hall from up in the Dallas area just today put out an explanation of his positions on his vote, which I thought really encompassed some of the concerns that we have and are hearing about SB2, particularly from the Christian community, whether it's home or private school, church school, in some of these areas. So I'm going to walk through a couple of these things, just these item by item, and just address those. Because I can tell you that as a, again, homeschool family with deep convictions about why we did it, and deep convictions about our children doing this, and with respect for every family out there who is sacrificing to send their children to a church or private school, then there's some relevant questions that we believe have adequate answers and why we need to support SB2. So let's just start right at the top, the student funding question. Right now, this proposal on SB2 would direct $2,000 per eligible student to a family that was not going to use an accredited school. So that essentially would be homeschool families. If you choose to take that funding, $1,000 per student to use in the specified areas that this legislation directs, which are basically curriculum, specific classes, instructors, things that meet this standard. And yes, there are some standards, but that's actually okay because most of the homeschool families we know are exceeding those standards anyway already. So that's the $2,000, but $10,000 per student to families who decide to use this funding in a private accredited school situation. But your church school, a non-church private school, and or some variation that is accredited through the Texas Private School Association. And that's another choice for those families, $10,000 per student. Now, just to deal with one figure that keeps getting thrown out there right now, the funding per student in the government school system in Texas is $16,000 to $18,000 per year. That's actually what it's costing and going into the school system for every student. So don't be misled thinking that, well, this is just a portion or it's close to the same. That's a huge part of the funding still stays in the government school system without the student being in the school system. And so the money being redirected, being available to parents for this is not a majority or barely majority of the funding that will actually stay still in the school system. So that's one important factor to understand here in the opposition from those defending the government school system and opposing school choice. Another item is the government strings. Folks, the fact of the matter is that those of you are old enough to remember when homeschooling was illegal, and we're one of those. When we started homeschooling our children, homeschooling in our state had just been legalized a few years before that because of the hard-fought work of a lot of people. Same here in Texas in the mid-'80s is when homeschooling in most states eventually became legal, and that process began in the 70s. So homeschooling has not always been legal since we implemented the concept of compulsory education, which meant the government saying your children have to attend school. And that occurred, decades ago, well over a century ago. And then we moved from education in general to government education and government monopoly over education using taxpayer funding. So that's there. So until we eliminate compulsory education, your children have to go to school. Homeschooling is regulated. Now, thankfully, we can, because of the hard work and sacrifice and dedication of people here in Texas and other states. We have a minimal amount of oversight, and thankfully, in homeschooling. But that could change in a heartbeat. And if we elected the wrong people to office, and let's call them Democrats in particular, they could, and very often in some states, and possibly even in Texas, could easily go back to the outlawing of homeschooling, period, anyway. So there's an important factor to remember here, that we have to fight to defend it. But this issue here, there's this curriculum oversight and operational oversight of the school, including homeschoolers who decide to take this funding, is limited to basically saying that you announcing to the district, and in the case of the Education Service Agency, that you're schooling at home, and that you're choosing this funding, use this funding for approved vendors that provide education materials. Now, right now, pretty much every vendor that sells homeschool materials that families would choose from at this moment all already comply and already pass that standard. So it's not like they're going to step in and limiting that as well. So you'll still be able to use the curriculums that you choose. And frankly, again, if there's any hint of any kind in the wrong direction on this, then we simply tell families, just withdraw, do what you've been doing. Or if you're deeply concerned about that entirely, that it might head that direction and somehow they might get their hook in, then just do what you've been doing and homeschool and don't take the funding. And that's your choice. We believe that this will provide options without those oversights. And I've read the legislation several times through, and I feel comfortable that, especially right now, as we continue to maintain the leaders we have for the future, this will provide that limitations on the government's ability to provide any kind of oversight into church schools, homeschool families, and our private school settings. Also, certification standards. As we found out, not only are there no requirements in Texas for teachers to be certified in the government school system, but we found hundreds of teachers, in fact, just this last year, whose certification they did have was fake. So the nature of that being a benefit of the government school system, that the homeschoolers or private schoolers or whatever aren't certified teachers. Well, the government school system isn't providing that in many cases either. And for you parents who think somehow you're not qualified to teach your children, talk to my wife and millions of others who have stepped into this and have done a fantastic job of educating their children through programs and materials. So there's a lot of those kind of myths as well. We're also going to address the limitation on rural access. We've been told, well, in rural communities, there's a limited number of private schools, so children, will be trapped into the government schools, or they don't have the options out there anyway. Well, guess what? When this government school system is absorbing the massive amount of multiple billions of dollars, $92 billion a year in Texas is what's going into the government school systems, K through 12. When all that money is being absorbed into one monopoly, then it's no wonder there's no competition. The families can't afford it. So guess what's going to happen when all those families when there's options out there, we're going to see churches starting schools right and left. We see homeschool co-ops, other variations of educational programs start up because of this being available. So that's a non-answer and not defensible as far as those issues in rural areas. Only benefits the wealthy. Really? The wealthy can the wealthy can private school right now. And many of them do, including, by the way, the ones opposing school choice that are politicians who send their kids to private schools. So the fact of the matter is that this provides an option, $10,000 per student. So if you got 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever that number is, that's that amount that you can now apply. And I'll tell you, as a homeschool family, most homeschool families in particular and private schools do a massively better job with far fewer resources and provide excellent materials, programs, and education that actually teach the children. And they not only just teach them academics, but teach them character and principles and ethics and cognitive thinking and reason and history and so forth. So there's a lot of reason why, again, that whole issue of this is just helping the wealthy is a non-starter, because of the fact the ones that are trapped the most in the worst schools and the worst systems are in the urban areas, which are the lowest income per household areas that will benefit the most. So that's not complicated. The bottom line is, look, we have an opportunity in Texas this year, pastors and your families in your churches, and we have to step into this. because this is a way to break the monopoly of the government system that has been put in place by radical secular humanists over 100 years ago to strip away the faith and the values and the relationships of children to their family and their God. And that's not even a question. That's history. That's documented. And we're not anti-government school here. If people choose to put their kids in that, they should feel free to. You have the right to. But we should no longer accept the premise that we're going to be forced by the sword to pay taxes fully and literally with no end in sight, by the way, because there's never enough money for the government school system. Trust me, as we well know, it's never enough. Then we don't have options as families to sacrifice deeply, and many have, and many will continue to. And frankly, it's worth it. Our children are worth it. But here's the question. In this country, the United States of America, with a government that is of, by, and for the people, where we have a constitutionally limited government that has limited purposes. One of those purposes under our U.S. Constitution was not to educate our children. And frankly, our state constitution is not directed to dictate the control of the content of our education either. It's to provide, make the way for free public education. But even that provides a limited framework of what the state should be controlling. Parents, God gave us the children. They were a gift from God. The Word of God says very clearly, parents, train up your children in the way they should go. And when they are old, they will not depart from it. Write these precepts on the doorposts when they're walking, when they're sitting, when they're standing up. We're told very directly who the children are responsible for and to, and so forth. So pastors, it's time we step up to the pulpits and call our parents to take the responsibility, whatever that takes, whatever's necessary, to show up, stand up, and be responsible for our kids. And not just send them on the bus to the school without question. We're past that day. And this SB2, this legislative session, is finally an opportunity for us to take a step forward and broadening the options for families. Let's get that done. So we'll be following up on this. Contact your state senator, your state representative. Let them know that you support SB2. Encourage and pray for the governor, Senator Brandon Creighton, who is the author in the Senate side, Chairman Buckley, who's the chairman on the House side of the Education Committee, and all of them. But that God will raise up standard in this time for us to be a faithful voice and steward of all that he's given to us and be mindful of the next generation. Thank you. God bless you. And we will see you, hopefully, pastors in Austin on March 13th at the Texas Pastor Policy Conference. Go to our website, register, and be there. And the governor, lieutenant governor, we're hoping the attorney general, some of our state rep senators, other issues, experts will be there. We need to be there, show up, and let our presence be felt there, and not just our prayers, but our presence, and go take a stand. Thank you. God bless you.